Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Modern SOC Summit. Today, we're going to cover supply chain compliance and privacy for cloud-native ecosystems. And my name is George Gerchow, CSO of Sumo Logic. But more importantly, I want to introduce my very, very good friend, colleague. Really excited to work with this guy. We've done a lot of stuff together, but it's been a minute. His name is John Wisniewski, and he's a CISO of Accolade. John, welcome.
Thank you so much, George. It's great to be here. I'm not so sure I'm important, but it's always a pleasure to be here with my Sumo brothers and sisters and the audience today. I couldn't be happier to be here.
Awesome. Well, you're as important to me as the Denver Nuggets, so that means something. Well, let's jump right into it, John. And before we start really getting into the slides too much, I think that we're probably both in agreement. You come in from the healthcare space. Obviously, we are stewards of quite a bit of data when you think about logging, monitoring, cloud SIM, and all the good things that we bring to the table. And we are getting an absolute root canal these days over supply chain. I mean, it is nonstop, with all the recent breaches that we've seen out there. And this goes back in time, right? It goes all the way back to the Target breaches and everything else that's happened. More than ever, I believe today, and I'd love to get your thoughts really quickly before we dive in too deep into this slide. This is happening across the board, and it's sucking up a lot of time. And you're only as strong as your weakest link in your security fabric. So I'd love to get your thoughts initially.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not only are you only as strong as the weakest link in your security fabric, our ecosystems are getting so complex, and the amount of data that we share with third parties, and they share with third parties. I like to talk to my CEO and our board about the 6 degrees of cyber Kevin Bacon. Truly, that's what makes this a challenging problem to tackle, is that not only do you need to be concerned about your direct third parties, but also concerned about how they manage vendors, how they manage their ecosystem, how they manage their environment. And that can become an exponential problem as you grow as an enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the past, it's always been kind of like the CYA, these massive questionnaires that people would kick back and forth with some legal ramifications. But I think we go way beyond that now. One of the things that you've always said, for many, many years, which I think is true, is the idea of partnership and picking who you're going to partner with and having and establishing that trust and transparency. If something's going wrong, you need to let your partner know and get it out in the open, and then work together to be able to mitigate whatever that may be.
Yeah, absolutely. The partnership aspect of it goes way beyond your typical questionnaires or way beyond any vendor that's trying to sell you something that's going to secure your supply chain. The best way to secure your supply chain is to have a one-to-one relationship with each one of those vendors, with each one of those partners, that goes way beyond how much you pay them or way beyond the contractual language that protects you. At the end of the day, a breach might have contractual ramifications, but it's still a breach. And the way to get ahead of those things is to have that partnership with transparency with those partners in order to protect yourself.
Yeah, agreed. And as we start, going through the slide, folks can just read exactly, if you're not up to speed on exactly what a supply chain is, but it's really looking at the elements of your software fabric and, like you said, inspecting, working with your partners, making sure that everyone's up to speed to protect your internal, external customers and the entire ecosystem. But let's start with bullet point number 1. When I start thinking about the SDLC or the CI/CD pipeline, developers are moving at a rapid pace, and we want them to, right? We just want to provide those guardrails. But as we're going through that process, there's some elements, I think, where those guardrails are more important than ever now. When I start tying in bullet point number 1 and number 2, I love open source software. And I'm going to bring up a slide here in a second, which is going to be shocking at how much it's changed since we've been looking at it for 4 years. But what are your thoughts about providing those guardrails and then open source software in general?
Well, it's tough, right? Because not only are you talking about an SDLC and one single pipeline, organizations like yours, organizations like mine, we have multiple agile teams across multiple business operations and business verticals. And so you're not just talking about, I can concentrate in one particular area. You have to be able to have those relationships built with those agile teams, relationships built with your DevOps teams, your developers, your engineers, in order to really help them and educate them as to best practices when it comes to those open source platforms and the third-party software, so that you don't have to be everywhere all at once in that pipeline in order to secure it. Developers love open source. I love open source. Exactly, because it gives you that freedom of maneuver that can help you accelerate your business processes. But at the same time, having an understanding of what doesn't come with that open source software. Engineering support, someone to call when something breaks, someone to let you know when you need to update things. The basics, those can be sort of the challenges with open source. And so helping your developers and your organization understand the cost benefit analysis that comes with freeware versus, building a partnership with a vendor that comes with that level of support.
Just facts all over that, and same. I'm a huge fan of open source software as well too. I think it's just a matter of being honest and transparent. Once again, where's it being used? How's it being used? And then having that risk acceptance behind it.
Yeah, the way I've usually tried to cage it in my organization and in previous organizations is I totally understand. Sometimes when the plane is about to take off, you realize it's too heavy and you have to start cutting off parts, right? You have to save money somewhere. But it's our job as security practitioners to make sure that we didn't cut off the landing gear and we didn't cut off the flaps and we didn't throw out the parachutes. And to a large extent, that sort of analysis is something that needs to be a common conversation between your security organization and your developers.
Yeah, let's switch to bullet point number 4. So partners who store and process data on behalf of the enterprise. Well, that's kind of right up my alley, right? And in some ways up yours as well too, when it comes to healthcare. And I think this is a very important point of focus because, like 6 years ago when I got to Sumo Logic, I can't believe it's been 6 years. People were so reluctant to give us, critical data because they were like, oh my gosh, it's going out to the cloud. Where's it really going? It's leaving the perimeter and all those good things. And we put in the work and the rigor even before I got to Sumo Logic to get certifications, attestations that matter, that are big differentiators, and really focus on our overall security posture. And as you mentioned, even with development, baking security into the DNA of the company. Yes. Not just for security team, not just the compliance team, but making it a security first type company, both internally and externally. So I'd love to get your thoughts about that and then how you partner with people around people who store that kind of data.
Yeah, well, the way that we do it internally is this idea of a member experience, a customer experience, right, from tooth to tail. When we have customers that come to Accolade, they're not just coming to get our services. They are coming because they trust us. They trust us because the PHI we handle isn't just an ancillary or tangential to our business. It's the core of the business, right? We process PHI in order to serve our members at the very core. And so the idea of that sort of member experience from tooth to tail, from the second they log on to your mobile application, they need to have an understanding that their data is going to be protected. And so when it comes to dealing with vendors providing professional services, they should have that same sort of mindset. If we're passing data to you, there's an inherent trust there, right? And so we're passing along that member experience to those particular vendors. And so making sure that you bake in the right contractual language, compliance language, and all that sort of stuff is great. But really rolling up your sleeves and helping them understand the way that you look at dealing with business and dealing with PHI, not just the way that they're going to be handling it, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. 100%. Trust and assurance, right? That's kind of the whole ball game right there. So here's a money slide. And John, this is incredible. If you think back, years ago, you and I created some slides like this together, back when you were with Pokemon. And then when we were first started getting, through our journey at Sumo of rebuilding our SOC, our next gen SOC, and look at how much it's changed. The maturization is insane. And one of the ways I like to refer to this is cybersecurity resiliency, because that's really what I believe you get when you have a very secure program like ours and yours. Like, look, knock on wood, every time you say that, you always open yourself up to an attack, but we're pretty confident that we have one of the best, if not the best, world-class SaaS-based internal security program. And so when you look at this and just kind of look at the legend, you can see open source in a few parts of this stack. And they're ones that, yes, they're a risk, but we work very closely with it. We work very, very closely with the community to outline the use cases that you see across the top as far as capabilities, and then how this drives automated security and compliance towards our certifications and attestations, and then our trusted auditors as well too. And then obviously we feed all this into Sumo just like you do. But I'd love to get your thoughts about the update on this thing. It's crazy to see, isn't it?
Well, one, wow, things have grown in the last few years. And two, when I look at this, when I look at this slide, I don't see logos, and I don't see open source and current state and future state. I see an orchestra, right? And at the end of the day, not everyone is going to be the first chair violinist. But you need those supporting elements in order to make that first chair violinist sing. And so it's not a matter of no open source versus only open source versus I need everything off the shelf versus that. It's understanding how that modular architecture is going to support each other element. And so that's why it's really cool to see something like this, because it really can show that, it's not just a one size fits all for your device management. It's not just a one size fits all for your insider threat. It's a matter of figuring out how you can support some of the core elements of your architecture with open source tools, with different layers. It's sort of like the next generation of that defense in depth cliche, but it's a cliche because it's absolutely true, right?
It is, and it's so funny you say that because like yesterday, Garish was asking about some of the IANS presentations in Houston and Dallas, and defense in depth was like the first layer, and then it became least privilege, and then now we're moving towards zero trust. And as much as those may be catchphrases, they're all just true, and zero trust being a framework or a mentality that we're trying to achieve. I think it's really important to start outlining and setting those types of goals. And so when I look at this fabric, it really allows me, and again, thanks, Roland. When I look at this fabric, it really allows me to take a close look and say, who are my trusted partners? Where do I have some overlap? Who do I need to maybe inspect a little bit more? Who's had possible breaches, in the media? And then trying to get ahead of it too, like you said, if I'm in constant contact with these folks, learning about their programs, learning about what they're doing internally, not only do I learn from them, but then we can also talk about areas of struggle together, which is something that you and I have always partnered on over the years. If you're struggling with something, most likely I am. And so we might as well attack that together and bring our teams together to figure out what that looks like moving forward.
Exactly. And not only is it sometimes I'm struggling with something that you are, it might be something that you're struggling with, and then 6 months from now, there's a very similar situation that we have to respond to. I think my favorite's probably the wrong word, but we're security professionals, so we wake up with this stuff every day. But my favorite is the SolarWinds incident recently, right? And just how wide sweeping it was. Thankfully, my organization, knock on all the wood, that I'm not going to bring on some bad juju over the next 6 months, but my organization wasn't impacted. But I had an obligation to my customers and to my partners to reach out and be open and honest about, this is where our infrastructure is. This is why we weren't impacted. That said, we are still taking some steps to make sure that we are covering down on all of the patching, all of the second and third order effects of that particular attack, and being upfront and honest with our customers and our partners. That honesty and that transparency upfront buys me the credibility so that someday, again, knocking on that wood, someday when something like that does happen to me, it's not fresh, it's not crazy, it's something that we can kind of step through.
Let's dive in a little bit to that, and let's sort of put on our federal government hats. As you know, we're a FedRAMP shop, and you and I are both prior military. One of the things that's been surprising to me, and I'd love to get your thoughts around this, is how a lot of federal entities, and I'm not picking on them, like all of us are in different positions. I make decisions all the time that people from the outside could be like, wow, why is George doing that? But one of the things that's really surprised me, John, is how people are looking at just replacing SolarWinds with something else instead of how they can change their strategy to more of a microservices, advanced type software development type company with integrations into APIs and moving maybe faster to the cloud. I see a mixed bag. I see a lot of people just going, this was the problem, I'm just going to switch out that problem with the potential another problem. So what are your thoughts around that?
You're right. They're switching out a problem for another problem. Anytime you have a single point of failure, you're in trouble, right? And anytime you think about your architecture as immovable or just this giant monolith, and that's the challenge, frankly, that the federal government has, military organizations and things like that. Their enterprise is so large, and the contracts they have to have get so expensive and are for so long that it's really hard to get out of those. It's really hard to change things around. And so what that ends up meaning is that when there's something like SolarWinds that is so prevalent in their architecture and there's a problem, it's much easier just to say, let's change that thing. Let's replace that instead of rethinking our strategy as a whole. And to your point, getting more towards a microservices model or things that are much more modular so that you can make small changes to your architecture that have big impact, as opposed to these like wide sweeping changes. I'm not sure if this is true. I don't work at SolarWinds, and I don't know anyone that works at SolarWinds, but it's one of those old adages that, like, wouldn't you think that maybe they're probably working harder than anybody to secure their infrastructure at this point? Wouldn't you think that they're probably maybe the safest bet at this point? It was the same thing when Zoom had all those troubles at the very beginning of the pandemic. Like, the idea wasn't, oh, let's all just switch to Teams. The idea was, okay, give these guys a chance, guys and gals a chance to fix their shop, give them a chance to secure things. And guess what? When they come out on the other end of this, they're going to be much healthier than they were in the beginning and much healthier than a lot of their peers.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, right? Because now they're going to double and triple down. And this is one of the issues that I see within our industry and security and compliance as a whole, is that a lot of times it takes that major incident to take place for you to get the proper funding and everything else that you need. It's like selling insurance. You're always saying, what if, what if, what if, what if? I think you and I have gotten away from selling insurance over the years, a bit more proactive about aligning with the strategy and the agility of the company and baking in security into our services, which, again, that's one of the things that I think gives SaaS a real advantage, is that you can do that. It's part of the service. So instead of doing everything on your own, it's baked in, but you have to have a lot of trust in companies like ours to be able to do that. But that's selling insurance piece, it's just such a shame. And I feel sorry for the folks over at SolarWinds that it took this kind of incident for them to be able to catch up from that. But I want to get your thoughts really quickly on one thing. If we go over to vulnerability management, you start looking at that stack, something that you and I have talked about in the past. And I know that we both had sort of a love-hate relationship with bug bounties. But what are your thoughts about running bug bounties on potential new partners or vendors that you're bringing in? What do you think about that?
That's a tough one. I love the idea in theory, right? I love the idea in theory. But are those partners going to love the idea in theory? And have you done
They're not.
Have you done the work up front to help them understand why you're going about it in that particular way? Have you done the work of building that partnership in such a way that they're comfortable doing something like that? I mean, it's tough. I throw that right back at you, George. If I'm a new Sumo Logic customer, would you let me run bug bounty programs on your infrastructure?
Well, I look at it this way, John. If I'm already running a public bug bounty program, and then you can just be part of that platform. But sort of, I guess, because the question I asked you was just a really hard one, and it's something that we're going through now, which is if our partners have that level of security running bug bounties, and then it's a level of comfort that I like. I like looking to see, hey, I don't care how many criticals and highs you got, but how fast did it take for you to remediate that? How honest were you about it? And then if you mesh that in with what you see on the far right of this slide with those certifications and attestations, as you know, that doesn't mean that we're secure, but it means that we have a program that we've invested heavily in. And then ultimately a conversation like this between you and I to get to establish trust, get to know each other better, and credibility, it may be avoided. But in some cases, we're starting to consider, if something goes a little bit wrong in these conversations, or it looks like there's not a bit of transparency, it's something that's a consideration. So I just wanted to get your thoughts around it, because I know that you've run multiple bug bounty programs at different organizations.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you touched on, do you have a plan? Have you thought about it, right? If I had a nickel for every time I heard a peer or heard someone in the industry talk about, man, I wish I had a vulnerability disclosure program. I really wish I had listened to that cold email or that cold call. Like, it's 2021, George. We can't be ostriches with our head in the sand when it comes to someone emails us and says, hey, I found this thing, pay me $10,000 and I'll let you know what it is. Maybe it's fake, but maybe it's absolutely real. And if you haven't thought through in the first place, how are you going to deal with those sorts of things? And that's where bug bounty programs can be excellent. But there's no one size fits all. But what I'm more concerned with is are my partners or are my vendors actually thinking proactively when it comes to vulnerability disclosures?
Yeah, 100%. And that's it. And I think, this is one of the areas where a certification like FedRAMP really helps. You guys obviously have got a federal program over there. when you have to do those continuous monitoring reports monthly for government agencies, it forces that kind of function. And again, looking across the supply chain, these vulnerabilities can show up in your own fabric. I'm not going to point any fingers, but we've made some recent changes in that vulnerability management stack at the endpoint where certain people weren't passing their own scans, and it's like, you're not passing your own PCI scans. How can I continue to work with you? And especially when there's not full disclosure and communication as to why. So I think, thank you for reconfirming that, because I think the planning piece is just massive. And I think before we go off the slide and jump into the next one, when you look across this, is there anything I think unique for your organization, because we're only looking at internal Sumo now, that maybe you would shift or add, or anything you want to augment this with?
I'm not sure about augmenting, but maybe continually highlighting and bolding the access management piece. You touched on it earlier with the zero trust, and let's not get too buzzwordy, but identity is the new perimeter is another one of those adages that's absolutely true. And access management is just becoming such a bear and so important for us to get really good at, really fine-grained, understanding the difference between place where you really need to guard and places that you can let the business organization or the business owner be more of the gatekeeper. I mean, that's really where I think we're going to be making money over the next 5 years, is thinking through how do we do that better? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about securing your organization. It's about empowering your organization to get the right resources at the right time to the right people. And so I think that would be the only thing is continually thumping on how important access management is going to be for all of us over the next 5 or 10 years.
So this is great, because you and I haven't discussed any of this previously, and access management, as you can see, is the very first bucket that we attack. Mm-hmm. We think that is the largest area of investment for us to start logging. Obviously all of this goes into Sumo as the first data source, and then we start mixing in these other data sources to truly start recognizing these potential threats, and then making sure that folks have the right amount of access that they need and aren't going beyond and above that, which is really, really difficult to do.
Well, I mean, and if you get access management wrong, that's the fastest way to become the least popular person at your organization.
One of the things that we implemented is 15-minute session idle timeout. You have to re-authenticate. Mm-hmm. And people don't like it, man. But it's one of those things where you have to set a policy. Yes. You have to be. You don't want to keep people from moving quickly. You don't want to keep people from moving their job, from not being able to do their job. But at the same time, you have to have controls in place. If I'm idle in an app for 15 minutes, I mean, come on, I think that's justification to have to re-authenticate. So I'm so glad that we focused on that quite a bit, because that's one of the areas in the supply chain that we've really thought through quite a bit. Thank you, FedRAMP. We had to do 3 different solution providers in 2020, but we settled in on the ones that you saw. And I think you're right. I think that's the first place people should start when they're looking at their supply chain, and then who they're going to partner with and how to really become secure in the cloud.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so let's start wrapping up here as we start giving people like areas to take a look at, supply chain best practices. I think mapping out the threat landscape, as we mentioned before, is really, really important. But I think it all starts really with focusing on what you can control. So, on the call yesterday, I had a guy that was like, I'm in healthcare and I have 1,000 different vendors that I work with. And I'm like, yes, I get that across the whole org, but how about starting with security and IT first? And then really taking a look at your fabric and then seeing what the potential threats and risks are. So I'd love to get your thoughts around how to scale that down a little bit, where to start, and then how to grow.
So my team at this point probably takes a drink every time I say visibility. Visibility. Right?
Bob Newhart.
And to your point, none of our teams are big enough, and we don't have tooling in general that can give us true 100% across the board visibility. So really the key is exactly what you're saying. Start with the places that you really have control over, that you have granular control over, that your folks or your IT teams or your technical folks can really not just control when it comes to access management and compliance controls and regulations and things like that, but truly having an understanding of the overall impact those controls have onto the rest of the ecosystem, right? Because everything's tied in. We're all complex organizations, and really thinking through, when you say map out the threat landscape, it's thinking about one system and what are the second and third order connections that those systems have, and concentrating your efforts on the ones that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, right? Slow is steady, steady is fast, start small, scale big, all of those sort of pluralities. But really what it comes down to is really having a good understanding of, not just where the keys to the kingdom, what your enterprise data warehouse or whatever it is at your organization, but really what's the system that has the biggest impact on the rest of the ecosystem. And sometimes it'll surprise you what that system is.
Yeah, it's like what you said in the beginning, 6 degrees of what?
At this point, I'm going to call it the 6 degrees of George Gerchow, but. Yeah.
But it's so true, right? Because it's all a funnel ecosystem effect. And I think the next one, so this one I like, but I struggle with, and I'll tell you why. I like policies and governance are very important to have. It should be very clear what the mission is and what you're asking people to do and getting adherence to that. But I also like accountability too, right? It goes back to trust but verify. Yeah. Policy is just a policy unless you can actually enforce that policy and be able to detect when someone's not following that policy. And it's not that we want to go out there and monitor everyone all the time, but I'd like to get your thoughts around that, because I see people increasing governance and increasing policy. But again, I think I should also have a way to verify that.
So analogous to what you said earlier about your security, your security chain is only as strong as its weakest link. A policy stack and a policy framework is only as strong as your ability to enforce it. And if there's a policy that you have in there that is unenforceable or not enforced, really it means that your organization can break most of those policies because they can point to the one that doesn't get followed at all, right? All of us have these compliance objectives, high trust CSF, FedRAMP, all those sorts of things. And we're really fond of saying compliance does not equal security. And that's absolutely true. But what it also means is that we need to be really open and honest about, I have this really beautiful policy set that I send out to prospective customers or I send to the auditor. The next question we really need to be honest with ourselves about is, how am I actually enforcing that? How am I enforcing it from a people perspective? How am I enforcing it from a process perspective? And most importantly, for the nerds out there, what technical controls do I have in place that are actually enforcing that policy, right? Trust but verify, as you're fond of saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why, like when we start looking across that supply chain, we really got to dig into those policies, and we can't just say, oh my gosh, we need to make an exception because we have this big event going on and we're just going to slide this vendor right on in that's brand new. We just can't do that anymore. We got to be able to go through those checks and balances to make sure things are taking place.
Absolutely.
So control information privileges, we talked quite a bit about that. A lot of that, goes with access and identity management, which we really hit throughout the presentation. Reduce the risk from developer endpoints, I think is big too. When we start getting a good idea of what that freeware, shareware looks like. But in wrapping up, my favorite subject, my favorite part is analytics, logs, and more logs. You and I sort of live and die by this. Obviously, I drink my own champagne working for Sumo, but just a couple quick comments about that before we wrap up for the audience.
Yeah, so I laugh that this is your favorite topic. Oh, you mean that the CISO for Sumo Logic is fond of talking about analytics and logs? Of course. Yeah, the CISO of Accolade is really fond of talking about PHI and machine learning and how we protect health data, of course. But back to that visibility piece, right? How many times in your career have you had a situation where you looked at your team or you were the guy being looked at, and the question was, do we have a log for that? Can we actually look back? Can we actually figure out what the heck happened? In an investigation or fine tuning your environment and things like that. And if you don't have logs, frankly, you just can't do it, right? And I think you probably run into that with a lot of your customers, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. Visibility, I'm with you. It'd make a great drinking game for us to talk about. And by the way, thank you for your service and passing on all that PHI and everything else. So really, really, really appreciate that. So with that, and I apologize, my dog in the background is telling me that it's time. He works very closely with Andy, which I appreciate. But JB, thank you so very much for your time today, for your knowledge. This is going to be a great event, and I really appreciate you.
Always a pleasure, George. And you know what? I cannot wait. I cannot wait until I can be in the same room as you and the rest of the Sumos and sharing a beverage and catching up on what a crazy year it's been. Thank you so much for having me, and can't wait to see you, brother.
Cool. Take care. Thanks.
Yeah.